Tonight's story is a quiet one, the kind that begins with something small and harmless. A lost key, a missing watch, a house that sits too close to a forest that always gives things back. But what it returns isn't always what was taken. Settle in, dim your lights, and let me tell you about Elliot and the forest behind his childhood home that remembers him a little too well. If you enjoy dark, slow-burn sleep stories like this one, make sure you subscribe. I release new stories every week, and each one is crafted to help you drift off while keeping your mind wrapped in mystery. Now, let's begin. Elliot arrived at his father's old house just after 4 in the afternoon, when the light was beginning its slow slide toward evening. The place looked smaller than he remembered, though most childhood places did. The paint had thinned, the gutters sagged slightly, and the windows held that faint cloudiness that came from years of condensation and weather. But it was the same house. Same sloped roof, same crooked mailbox, same narrow path leading around to the back garden. And beyond the back garden, the forest. It stood like a dark mass behind the property, so dense that the first line of trees looked pressed together, shoulder to shoulder. The branches tangled above them in a canopy thick enough to blot out most of the sky. Even from the driveway, Elliot could see the narrow gap, just wide enough for one person, that cut into the woods like a throat. His father had always called it the old path. Elliot opened the front door with the spare key the solicitor had sent him. The hinges groaned, and a draught of stale, slightly damp air drifted out to meet him. Inside, the house felt paused, as though someone had stepped out halfway through living. A mug sat on the kitchen counter beside an overturned teaspoon. A jacket hung from the back of a dining chair. The old radio on the windowsill had been left on the country music station, though now it played only static. Elliot switched it off and stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle. He was here to clear things out, to sort documents, box up belongings, decide what to keep and what to give away. It felt too big a task for the day, so he put down his bags, filled a glass with cold tap water, and walked toward the back door. That was where he always ended up looking. The glass pane in the back door was slightly warped with age, bending the view of the forest into faint curves. The little concrete step outside was still cracked down the middle. A tired patch of grass stretched 10 feet before surrendering to the tree line. There it was, that narrow path slipping between 2 beeches. The entrance to the forest. A memory stirred, faint but persistent. His father's voice, telling him the rule every local kid learned before they were old enough to wander on their own. If you lose something in the forest, it'll come back. Might take a day, might take a week, but it always comes back. As a child, Elliot had half believed it. As an adult, he'd assigned it to folklore, nothing more. Still, he found himself stepping onto the back step, the air cool and smelling faintly of wet leaves. He walked down onto the grass, feeling the earth give slightly under his shoes. A breeze moved through the trees, rustling leaves in a low hush. The forest waited. He didn't step into it, not fully. He wasn't ready for that. Instead, he walked along the edge of the garden, letting his fingers brush the frayed tops of the grass. The keyring in his hand jingled softly each time his foot fell. He hadn't meant to bring the keys outside at all. Another breeze came, cooler this time, and he looked toward the path. Shadows seemed to thicken there, though the sky hadn't changed. "That's enough exploring," he muttered to himself, turning back toward the house. His foot slipped on something. No, not slipped. Something pulled lightly, barely noticeably, but enough to make his fingers loosen. His keys fell from his hand and dropped into the scrubby grass at the edge of the trees. He sighed sharply. Great. He crouched and parted the blades of grass. Nothing. He brushed his hand left, then right, sweeping through leaves and stems. Still nothing. "Come on," he murmured, checking again, more carefully this time. He pushed aside a small clump of weeds, dug lightly into the soil with his fingertips. He could feel the cold earth against his skin. No keys. He straightened and wiped his hands on his jeans. The rational explanation was simple. They'd landed somewhere he wasn't looking. Maybe bounced under a root. Maybe fallen deeper into the growth than he'd realized. He checked for another 5 minutes. 10. He crouched, knelt, moved tufts of grass independently. Still nothing. He wasn't angry, just unsettled by how completely the keys had vanished in the span of a second. "Fine," he said to the forest, absurdly. "Keep them." He went back inside. He had the spare key that opened both doors. He'd deal with the problem later. The sun was sliding lower now. Shadows in the house stretched in long strips across the floor. Elliot filled the kettle, made tea, and sat at the kitchen table for the first time in years. He kept glancing at the back door. He told himself it was only habit. When you grew up with a forest at your back, you spent a lot of time checking that it was still where it should be. As the evening settled into a dusky blue, he finally stood and flicked on the small porch light outside the back door. The light buzzed, flickered once, then steadied. And there on the concrete step were his keys, placed carefully, neatly, as though someone had set them down with intention. Elliot froze. He hadn't used this door. He hadn't stepped out this way since arriving. He'd lost the keys 20 minutes ago, at least a dozen feet into the grass by the forest line. Now they were back, clean, dry, arranged. He stared, unmoving. His father's voice drifted back again. "If you lose something in the forest, it'll come back." The air seemed to thicken around him. His heartbeat tapped against his ribs. But there was no movement outside, no sound beyond the faint hum of insects drawn to the porch light. He opened the back door slowly. The hinges creaked. The forest stood silent and still. He stepped onto the threshold and reached down. The keys were cold, colder than the night air, almost metallic in a way that felt deeper than temperature. He closed his hand around them and stepped back inside, locking the door firmly behind him. He set the keys in the hallway dish, exactly where his father had always kept his. Then he stood there a moment, just listening. The house popped and settled. A car drove by on the distant road. Somewhere upstairs a floorboard creaked with the old shift of timber adjusting. But behind those sounds, below them somehow, there was another quiet, the kind that felt aware. He shook himself out of it and went upstairs to the bedroom he'd slept in as a boy. The bed felt smaller than he remembered, the ceiling lower. He lay awake longer than he intended, listening to the wind move through the trees outside the window. Eventually, sleep took him. But just before he drifted under, he had the faint, uncanny sense that something out there, somewhere just inside the dark seam of the forest, was listening back. Elliot woke to the faintest light pushing through the curtains, the room washed in early grey. For a long moment he lay still, listening to the subtle sounds of the house, an old pipe contracting, the tick of the hallway clock, the quiet breath of wind against the windows. It was just past 6 when he checked his phone. Too early to do anything useful. Too late to fall back asleep. He got up, put on yesterday's clothes, and went downstairs. The keys he'd found on the step last night were still in the dish by the front door. He stared at them a moment. In daylight they looked harmless, just ordinary keys on an ordinary ring. But he remembered holding them in his hand, cold as river stones, when he brought them inside. He pocketed them anyway and went into the kitchen. As the kettle boiled, he found himself glancing again and again at the back door, at the forest beyond it. In the morning light, the tree line looked softer, but still dense enough that almost nothing of the sky was visible through the branches. He made coffee and sat at the table, planning the day ahead. Tackle his father's old paperwork, start sorting the closets, figure out which furniture could be donated. Work kept his mind quiet. By 10 o'clock, he'd made some progress. The living room floor was scattered with piles. Keep, shred, recycle, each one carefully organised. He found old bank statements, notebooks filled with his father's thin, neat handwriting, and stacks of yellowing letters tied in twine. At one point, he took off his watch to avoid scratching anything and set it carefully on the mantelpiece. He forgot about it until he needed the time. The mantelpiece was empty. He stood there, blinking at the blank wooden surface as though the watch might reappear if he stared hard enough. Then he checked the nearby shelves, the floor, the table, even the cushions. Nothing. It wasn't anger he felt. It was a cold, creeping confusion he tried to smother with logic. "I must have moved it," he muttered. But no amount of searching changed the fact that the watch was gone. He checked his pockets 3 times, then the kitchen, then the hall, then the upstairs landing. It wasn't anywhere. He'd been here before, yesterday with the keys. He felt the memory of that moment, stepping outside, the porch light flickering, the keys placed neatly in the centre of the concrete step, settle into his stomach like a weight. He told himself not to check. He told himself that doing so would be giving in to the idea. But still he found himself standing at the back door, one hand on the latch, breath slow, steady. He opened the door. Cold morning air spilled in. Birds scattered through the high branches. The grass glittered with leftover dew. On the concrete step, exactly centred, lay his watch. He let out a slow, shaky breath. It wasn't relief, exactly. More like confirmation of something he didn't want to believe. He stepped forward and picked up the watch. The leather strap was clean, completely dry, and cold again, unnaturally so. He fastened it back onto his wrist, closing the clasp with fingers that didn't feel entirely steady. "Someone's messing with me," he whispered to himself. "Has to be." But the yard behind the house was undisturbed. No footprints in the damp grass, no sign of movement, just the forest standing quietly in the sun, the entrance path darker than the surrounding ground. He closed the door and forced himself back into the rhythm of chores. For a while, the work helped. He organised the spare room, sorted clothes for donation, even found a toolbox in the hall cupboard that he hadn't known existed. He kept busy until early afternoon, when the ache between his shoulder blades forced him to take a break. He walked into the village for a sandwich, needing the feeling of other people nearby. The pub was quiet this time of day. A couple of locals sat at the bar. A farmer talked quietly to someone about lambing season. Elliot sat near the window and watched cars roll by on the high street. The bartender, a man in his 50s with tired eyes, brought him his food. "You're Paul's boy, aren't you?" he asked. Elliot nodded. "Yeah, just here sorting the house." The man leaned an elbow on a nearby table. "You used to run off toward that forest all the time. Gave your dad no end of worry." "I barely remember that," Elliot said. "You went missing once. Not long, maybe half an hour. Search party was nearly out before you turned up on your own." He smiled faintly. "Came out of the trees holding something. Some little red toy, wasn't it?" A cold, faint prickle moved down Elliot's back. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I had a toy like that." "Well," the man said, shrugging, "Forrest always did give things back. Always has." Elliot tried very hard not to ask the obvious question. Instead, he ate his sandwich in silence and headed home. The house felt different again when he returned. Not threatening, just watchful. As if it had expectations. He tried to shake it off. He went back to sorting paperwork, flipping through envelopes and files until a small stack was complete. When he reached for his pen to label a folder, it wasn't there. He checked under the papers. The floor. His pockets. Gone. "Of course it is," he murmured. He stood very still with his hand braced on the table, eyes on the back door without meaning to. He waited longer this time. When he finally approached the door, it felt like walking toward something inevitable. He opened it. The pen was standing upright in the grass, balanced impossibly on its tip. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The breeze moved gently through the yard, but the pen did not topple. It remained in that strange, perfect posture like a small marker placed there deliberately. He walked toward it slowly, picked it up, dry, clean, cold, always cold. He brought it inside and set it down carefully on the table, then sat in the chair and held his head in his hands. "This is nothing," he told himself quietly. "It's weird, but it's nothing." But he didn't believe that. He couldn't. There was a pattern now. Keys, a watch, a pen. Objects lost indoors, out of sight, returned outside as though delivered to the step with a kind of strange care. He glanced toward the forest through the window. The entrance path was shadowed even in daylight. The trees swayed slightly, and for a moment, a single passing moment, he had the eerie sensation that something deeper inside the woods had just turned its attention toward him. Not malevolent, not friendly either, just interested. As if the forest were waiting to see what he would misplace next. Elliot found the cat on the second morning. He'd stepped outside to shake dust from an old rug when he noticed a shape curled near the shed. At first, he thought it was a pile of leaves caught in the corner, but then it lifted its head, small, narrow, and alert. A cat. Thin, grey, with mottled fur and sharp green eyes. It watched him without moving. "Hey," Elliot said softly, more out of instinct than thought. The cat blinked once, then let out a quiet, rasping meow. He crouched a few feet away. "You lost, little guy?" It didn't run. It didn't approach either. It simply studied him with an intensity that felt unusual for a stray. He held out a hand, palm down. The cat sniffed the air but didn't come closer. He went back inside, opened a tin of sardines from a forgotten corner of the cupboard, and set the dish on the step. When he checked later, the food was gone, and the cat had retreated to the edge of the garden, sitting like a sentinel facing the forest. By afternoon, the cat had a name, Moss. It just fit, quiet, soft, something that clung to shaded places. Moss followed him at a distance, as though unsure whether to accept him, but unwilling to leave either. When Elliot worked in the living room, Moss perched on the windowsill. When he went to the kitchen, Moss padded behind him and sat near the door. Not too close, just close enough. It was a comfort he hadn't known he needed. Clearing a dead man's house was lonelier than he'd expected. On the third evening, Moss disappeared. Elliot was washing dishes after a simple dinner when a sudden, sharp movement outside caught his attention. He turned just in time to see the grey streak bolt across the garden, straight toward the tree line. "Moss!" He dropped the dishcloth and ran to the back door. By the time he stepped outside, Moss was already halfway down the narrow path between the trees. Its tail, normally carried low, was raised high and trembling with excitement or fear. He couldn't tell. "Moss!" he shouted again, but his voice sounded swallowed by the forest, made small by the space between the trunks. The cat paused for a heartbeat, one paw lifted. Then it slipped deeper into the shadows and vanished. Moss. Damn it. Elliot jogged to the start of the path, but something in him stopped short of entering. The moment his foot hovered over the packed earth, the forest felt expectant. Like stepping over that invisible line meant acknowledging something he wasn't ready to face. He stood there, breathing hard, scanning the dark. Nothing moved. He waited until the air grew cold and the birds quietened, then finally retreated inside, feeling as though he'd left a part of himself behind. He kept the back light on for hours that night. Moss did not return. The next morning, Elliot woke after a restless sleep full of half-conscious listening. He checked his phone, checked the kitchen, checked outside. No sign of the cat. He knelt at the edge of the yard, near the point where Moss had disappeared, and touched the soil. It was disturbed only by faint paw prints already dulled by dew. "Moss," he called softly. No answer. A heaviness settled across his chest. He'd barely known the cat, but its absence felt sharper than he expected. The quiet of the house felt bigger. The rooms felt colder. He tried to work on sorting the upstairs closets, but his attention kept sliding back to the forest, to the path, to the memory of that small grey shape darting into the trees. By early afternoon, he had stopped pretending to get anything done. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the back door. I should go look for him, he thought. But every time the thought arose, something cooler and more cautious rose with it. Don't go in there. He didn't know whether that fear came from childhood, from the house, or from the forest itself. The day dragged. Evening approached. At sunset, he turned on the porch light the instant the shadows got too long. "Just come back," he whispered to the window. "Please." It was nearly midnight when he heard it, a soft, uncertain scratching at the back door. Elliot froze. The sound came again, just two gentle scrapes against the wood. He moved slowly, as though afraid that sudden motion would make the moment vanish. His feet felt heavy, his breath felt shallow. He unlatched the door and opened it a few inches. Moss sat on the step. Relief flooded him, hot, dizzying, until something in his brain caught up to what his eyes were seeing. The cat was perfectly clean. Not just dry, not just brushed off. Clean in a way that made no sense for an animal that had spent an entire night in the forest. His fur was smooth, neatly parted, no burrs, no dirt on his paws, no leaves tangled in his tail, and his posture... Moss wasn't sitting like a cat easing home after a scare. He was sitting straight, very straight, as if placed. "Moss?" Elliot whispered. The cat lifted his head, and in the porch light, Elliot saw the eyes. Green, yes, but different. Too steady, too focused. The pupils didn't widen or narrow. They held on him like a fixed point. Then Moss stood. Not fluidly, not with the loose flexibility cats usually have. He stood carefully, deliberately, as if remembering how the body should move. A cold knot formed in Elliot's stomach. He knelt and held out a hand, palm up. "Moss?" The cat approached slowly, not creeping, not nervous, step by step, precise. And when Moss pressed his head into Elliot's palm, the relief returned briefly. The familiar weight, the soft fur, but the warmth was wrong. Not absent, just uniform. Same temperature everywhere, as if the cat carried no heat from his breath, no warmth in his chest, just one steady, strange coolness. Elliot swallowed hard, scooped Moss up and brought him inside. The cat didn't resist. He didn't react at all, just hung in Elliot's arms with an unsettling stillness. He set Moss on the rug by the radiator. The cat sat down immediately, facing the kitchen doorway. Not curled, not loafed, sat, watching. "Moss, are you okay?" The cat's ear twitched once, as if recognizing the sound but not fully processing it. He fetched a bit of food from the cupboard and placed it in a dish. Moss walked to it, paused, and then began to eat, slowly, each movement measured, as though mimicking the memory of eating rather than acting from instinct. Elliot stood there, unable to shake the rising dread building behind every breath. When he finally went to bed, Moss followed him up the stairs with that same unnerving calm. Elliot lay down, exhausted. The house creaked, the radiator clicked, and somewhere outside a night bird called. Then, in the dark, he felt a weight settle on his chest. His eyes opened. Moss sat there, paws tucked neatly, staring into his face from inches away. No blinking, no shifting, just watching him. Elliot held his breath and whispered, barely audible, "What did you bring back with you?" Moss tilted his head, slowly, exactly like a person considering a question. Elliot didn't sleep again. The next morning the house felt different. Moss moved around silently, padding through rooms as if mapping them. Elliot tried to go through his normal routine, but every time he slowed down, he could feel the cat's gaze settle on him. There was only one explanation he would allow himself to consider, even if he didn't want to. The objects the forest returned were never exactly the same. Now the forest had returned something living, something that looked like moss, something that moved like moss, but wasn't moss, not entirely, not anymore. Elliot woke to the sound of something shifting downstairs, a soft scrape, like claws dragging lightly across wood. He sat up too quickly, heart thudding. Moss? Silence. Morning light leaked through the curtains in a pale sheet. His head felt heavy, stuffed with the exhaustion of a night spent waking every hour. Each time he'd opened his eyes, he expected to see the cat perched somewhere in the room, watching. He found Moss sitting at the top of the stairs. The cat's back was perfectly straight, tail curled neatly around its paws, eyes fixed on him. Elliot paused. "Morning." Moss blinked once, slowly, in a movement so controlled it felt rehearsed. Elliot descended the steps, avoiding the boards he knew creaked. Moss didn't move aside. Elliot stepped around him carefully. The cat turned its head to track the motion with precise smoothness. Something about that small movement chilled him more than the cold floorboards. He made tea to steady himself. Moss jumped onto the kitchen counter, a behaviour Elliot had never allowed the cats he'd grown up with. Yet Moss seemed to be testing something. His presence on the counter felt deliberate rather than curious. "Not there," Elliot muttered, nudging him gently. Moss didn't move. He simply stared at Elliot until Elliot stepped away first. That was new. That was wrong. "You're acting weird," Elliot whispered, as though afraid the cat might understand him too clearly. Moss flicked an ear, but just one, the way a metronome ticks at the end of a bar. Elliot glanced toward the forest through the back door glass. The trees were still. The same narrow, dark path yawned between them like an open mouth. He needed air, needed space from the cat, needed to talk to someone who knew this place better. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. Moss stayed on the counter, watching his every movement until the door closed. The village was already stirring. A few people swept leaves from their front steps. A postman pedalled down the road. The bakery's door was propped open, allowing the warm smell of bread to seep into the cool air. Elliot followed muscle memory more than conscious thought until he stood outside a small stone cottage with blue shutters. Mrs. Daly's house. He hadn't visited her since he was a teenager, but she had once watched him during summer holidays, taught him how to tie knots, helped him bandage skinned knees, and given him advice he hadn't understood at the time. He knocked. Footsteps shuffled slowly to the door before it opened a crack. Her face appeared, older, thinner, but still soft around the eyes. "Elliot," she whispered. "I wondered when you'd come." He blinked. "You knew I was back? Your father talked about you often." She opened the door fully. "Come in, dear. You look troubled." He stepped inside and was washed instantly by warmth and the faint scent of cinnamon. Her cottage was cluttered in a comforting way. Books stacked in corners, blankets piled on the sofa, photographs lining every available surface. She guided him to the kitchen table, placed a teapot and 2 cups in front of them, and sat. "What's happened?" she asked gently. Elliot hesitated. Then the words spilled out about the missing objects, about the way they returned, about the pen balancing upright, about moss vanishing into the forest and coming back wrong. Mrs. Daly closed her eyes briefly, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "You've noticed it then," she said quietly. He leaned forward. "Noticed what?" A long pause. "The forest," she said, "keeps things, and it gives things back, but it never returns them the same." Elliot's mouth went dry. "Is this some folklore? A story? Because something's happening inside my house, and I need a reason, any reason that makes sense." Mrs. Daly didn't smile. She didn't soften it. "It isn't folklore," she said. "It's this place, this land." She reached behind her and pulled a small wooden picture frame from a shelf. She set it in front of him. A younger Mrs. Daly stood beside a tall man with broad shoulders and a warm, easy smile. "My husband, David," she said. "He went into the forest when he was 45, chasing after a neighbour's dog. He didn't come back that evening." Elliot swallowed. "For how long?" 3 days, she said softly. And then he walked out of the trees at dawn, perfectly clean, perfectly calm, not a scratch on him. A cold weight settled in Elliot's stomach. And he wasn't sick? No. Confused? No. Elliot shook his head. Then what was wrong? Mrs. Daly let out a breath that trembled at the end. David always hummed while he cooked, off-key, dreadful. He always wore mismatched socks. He ate too fast, talked with his hands, forgot names. She tapped the photograph with one weathered finger. Little things, unimportant things that made him him. And after, he was neat, she said, precise, too careful. He never raised his voice, never hummed, never mismatched a pair of socks again. Elliot stared at her, she added softly, and he never blinked at the right moments. The weight in Elliot's chest grew. Did people notice? They noticed something. But this village, we're used to the forest, used to its habits. Habits, Elliot echoed, the word tasting wrong in his mouth. Yes, she said. It's been doing this a long time. Replacing things, mimicking them. Objects first, then animals, then people. Elliot's hands felt cold around the mug. Why? No one knows, she said. The forest isn't malicious, but it isn't kind either. It isn't thinking the way we do. It sees something, learns it, returns it, but whatever comes back. She shook her head slowly. It isn't alive in the same way. It's a copy made from memory. Elliot felt his throat tighten. And everyone just accepts this? She nodded sadly. We learn to. Otherwise we leave, and leaving rarely changes anything. Things find their way back here. He didn't want to ask, but he had to. Mrs. Daly, how do you know this? Really know it? She took his hand gently and squeezed. Because the man who returned from that forest lived with me for 22 more years. He cared for me, protected me, but he was not my David. Elliot pulled his hand back slowly, feeling the air sharpen around him. And he never aged the same way, she added in a whisper. Is my cat? Yes, she said quickly, but not unkindly. It isn't Moss. That cold pressure in his chest tightened. Mrs. Daly reached across the table again, but stopped before touching him. And dear, she said, voice low, this is not the part I tell lightly. He waited. You went missing once too, when you were very small. Elliot stiffened. No, I didn't. My father would have told me. He didn't want you to remember, she said gently. You were only gone 20 minutes. You walked back out of the forest on your own, calm as anything. I don't, his voice caught. I don't remember that. You wouldn't, she said. Children forget easily, and your father loved you enough to pretend nothing happened. He stared at her, heart pounding. Elliot, she whispered, did you used to hum as a child? He blinked. What? Your father told me once, she said softly. You never hummed again after that day. Elliot felt a slow, icy shiver crawl up the back of his neck. Why are you telling me this? He whispered. Because the forest doesn't take things at random, she said. It takes what wanders too close, what stays too long, what it notices. He stood abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. Mrs. Daly looked up at him with a kind of resigned sadness. "Don't go into the forest," she said, voice barely more than breath. "Not for moss, not for anything. And if you see someone, anyone, you think you recognize in those trees, don't follow them. Don't answer them. Don't speak to them." Elliot's voice was hollow. "Why?" "Because the forest doesn't return people out of kindness," she said. "It returns them out of curiosity." He walked home slowly, mind numb, trying to steady the thoughts colliding with one another. The moment his house came into view, he saw Moss in the window, small, motionless, eyes locked onto him from behind the glass, watching. He stepped inside. The familiar smell of dust and stale air greeted him. Moss padded toward him, each movement measured like a rehearsed gesture. Elliot walked past him, unable to bear the intensity of that stare. He went into the living room and sat heavily on the couch. His father's scattered papers were still on the table. One page caught his eye, an old note in his father's cramped handwriting. E. lost 20 minutes, returned alone, quiet after. Quiet after, never hummed again. Elliot stared at that line until the words blurred. In the hallway, he heard Moss settle onto the floorboards with a soft thump, then nothing. Silence stretched through the house, steady, waiting. Elliot turned toward the back door. The forest stood outside, dark and still, as if listening, as if waiting for him to remember something he had forgotten. Elliot didn't remember standing up. He didn't remember crossing the living room. 1 minute he was staring at the yellowed page with his father's handwriting, lost 20 minutes, and the next he was at the back door, his hand resting on the cold metal latch. Moss sat at his feet, perfectly still. The cat's eyes were pinned to the forest as though something inside it was calling to both of them. Elliot whispered, "What did it do to me?" Moss didn't respond, didn't turn his head. He just kept staring into the dense wall of trees like a sentry. Elliot let his hand fall from the latch. He stepped back. He couldn't go in. Not after what Mrs. Daly told him. Not after seeing what had returned in place of Moss. But he couldn't stay still either. The house suddenly felt too small, as if the walls were leaning inward, listening. He backed away from the door and went upstairs. He packed quickly, shoving clothes into a duffel bag, grabbing his phone charger, stuffing a few papers he couldn't leave behind. His pulse was loud in his ears. He didn't know where he was going. A hotel, a friend's place hours away. Anywhere but here. Anything but this house. Downstairs, Moss moved silently from room to room. Elliot could hear the click of his claws on the wooden floorboards, precise, evenly spaced, like footsteps rehearsed. Elliot zipped his bag and took one last look at the house, the kitchen table, his father's old jacket on the hook. The hallway carpet worn thin in a path his father must have walked hundreds of times. Then he grabbed his keys from the dish. They were warm now, almost reassuring. He opened the front door. Cold evening air brushed against his face. The sky was dipped in blue, the day bleeding into night. A few house lights flickered on across the street. The world outside was normal, ordinary. He stepped onto the front path. Moss suddenly appeared behind him, standing in the doorway. The cat's silhouette was framed in the fading light, still as stone. "Stay inside," Elliot said, forcing his voice steady. Moss didn't blink. Elliot turned toward the car. The trunk was already open. He froze. He hadn't opened it. He was sure, absolutely sure, he hadn't touched the key's trunk button. He approached slowly, heartbeat rising. Inside the trunk, neatly placed in the center on the carpeted floor, was the object he had lost decades ago. A small, bright red toy car. The same one he lost as a child. It gleamed as though polished. No scratches, no fade, no dirt in the seams, just like the first time the forest returned it. His pulse hammered in his throat. He stepped back, almost tripping. "No," he whispered, "this isn't real." Behind him, the front door hinges creaked softly. He turned. A figure stood in the doorway. At first he thought it was someone tall, a neighbor maybe. But as the shape moved into the porch light, Elliot felt the bottom of the world tilt. It was him. Another him. Same height, same build, same clothes. The same faint scar over the right eyebrow, but cleaner, straighter, more composed, like a photograph made three-dimensional. The other Elliot stepped down onto the path, movements measured and controlled, the same way Moss had moved, eyes calm, breathing slow. "Hello," the other Elliot said gently, as though greeting an old friend. "You dropped something." He held out his hand. In his palm was that same red toy car. Elliot's chest tightened. "You're not me." The other him smiled. It was a polite, harmless smile, something learned, not lived. "I'm the part of you the forest kept safe," the double said. "The part it remembered." Elliot stepped back. "Stay away from me." "You shouldn't leave," the double said softly. "You weren't finished. The forest only wants to put things back where they belong. To keep things consistent." Behind the double, Moss walked down the front steps and sat next to it, watching Elliot with those two still eyes. The world seemed to shrink around him. "You replaced Moss," Elliot whispered. The double nodded calmly. "He wandered too far." "And you?" Elliot choked out. "Did I wander too far too?" "You did," the double said, "a long time ago." Elliot's skin prickled. 20 minutes in the forest, his father's frantic searching, the humming he never remembered stopping, the gaps in his childhood memories, everything Mrs. Daly had said. "What did you return?" Elliot whispered. His double tilted his head in that same unnatural arc Moss had used. "I returned you," the double said, "the first time." Elliot felt the ground shift under him. "So what am I?" he demanded. "You're Elliot," the double said, "as the forest understood you to be." "No," Elliot said, shaking his head. "No, that's—" "You've always been here," the double continued. "You've lived a whole life. You grew, you changed, you made choices, you became your own person, but the forest remembers the original, and it wants him back where he belongs." Elliot felt something like nausea rise in him. "You think you're the real one." "I don't think anything," the double said, stepping closer. "I remember, that's all." The sky had gone nearly dark now. The air felt heavy, pressing down on his shoulders. Elliot stepped backward until his back touched the car door. His bag slid from his shoulder and thumped against the ground. From the corner of his eye, he saw movement deeper in the street, just the faintest suggestion of someone standing at the edge of the trees. Or many someones. Shapes where there shouldn't be shapes. Copies, replacements, returned things. The double held out the toy car again. "It's time to come back." Elliot felt a cold, clear certainty settle in his chest. If he stepped toward that version of himself, if he touched that toy, if he accepted anything from the forest, he wouldn't come back from it. Not again. He turned and ran. He didn't know if it was toward help or just away from terror, but his body moved before his mind caught up. He sprinted down the road, past the last houses, past the circle of lamplight. Behind him he heard only one sound. Footsteps. Perfectly matched to his, not rushed, not frantic, just steady, as though his double knew he would tire first, as though the forest knew it had all the time in the world. Elliot didn't look back. He didn't have to. He already knew what was following him. Thank you for listening. If you made it all the way to the end, take a slow breath. You're safe now. The forest is far behind you, and whatever followed Elliot won't follow you into the rest of your night. If this story helped you drift off, or kept you thinking long after you closed your eyes, consider subscribing. I release new dark sleep stories every week, each one written with the same slow-burn tension and quiet unease you heard tonight. Your support helps me create more of these long, immersive tales, and I'd love to have you here for the next one. Sleep well, stay safe, and whatever you lose in the dark, don't go looking for it.